When I was a high school senior in 1974, my parents went downtown to dinner with some friends at a fancy restaurant. My sister was in college, so I was at home, alone. I was in the basement of our house, which is where the stereo was, and I was listening to some loud music, which is probably why I wear hearing aids now, but I digress. The album I was listening to had just finished, and I was in the process of picking out something else to listen to when I heard breaking glass. My first thought, which really made no sense, was that my sister had decided to come home, forgot her keys, and broke the window to get into the house. She never would have done anything like that. My second thought was, I think I'd better see what's going on. So I went up the basement stairs to the garage level of our house. I opened the door, and there were these three guys who were just about as surprised to see me as I was to see them. They were young, probably about 18 to 21, and they had broken into our house to steal some stuff. When I confronted them, two of the burglars ran upstairs and out of the front door of our house. The third guy, the oldest, pulled out a gun and told me to go upstairs. I did as I was told. He then told me that he and all of his friends had guns, and that if I called the police, he'd come back and kill me. He then ran out of the front door as well, and I was able to get a general description of the car that they were driving. Yes, I immediately called the police. When I told them that I was home alone, they asked me where my parents were, so I gave them the name of the restaurant, and they were kind enough to call them for me. I was shaking by this point. The cops arrived, asked a lot of questions, and after what seemed like hours, which was actually about 30 minutes, my parents arrived home. There were several odd things that happened. First, the police accused me of breaking the window and covering it up with a wild story. Secondly, they stopped some guy randomly a few miles away, brought him by in the dark, and then asked me to identify him from 35 feet away. I said I wasn't sure, but they arrested the guy anyway. He was later set free for lack of evidence. Third, the detectives that came by asked why the footprints in the snow outside of the window were obscured, and when I told them that the only people who had walked out there were other police officers, they got mad at me. Well, nothing happened for a while after this, and then one day I was asked to come in and take a look at some pictures. They had some big photo books, 3 of them with about 50 photos each, and asked me if anyone looked familiar. I immediately picked out the 3 perps. The detective at that point told me that they had arrested them on other break-ins, would now add this one to the case against the 3. I had to testify in court about 2 months later, and what was interesting is that the prosecuting attorney asked me and my parents to consider leniency towards the youngest of the 3 men. I agreed. He hadn't done anything except be with the other 2, and he wasn't that much older than me. He was given a suspended sentence and asked to pay reparations for the damage, which he did. About 4 years later, I got a letter from him stating how grateful he was with the second chance I had given him. He now had a steady job, was getting married, and of course hadn't seen the other men in years. I thank the prosecutor for giving this young man a second chance and persuading me to give it to him. It was about 1:30 in the morning. I had been asleep for a couple hours after drinking a good several beers. I'm woken up by loud stomping around upstairs, as this is in a house and I rent a room in the basement. I don't think too much of it beyond the fact that it's pretty annoying, as the people that I live with can be pretty loud at times. The stomping starts coming down the stairs though, and I think my roomie is pissed and is coming down to bitch about something. Then my room door is just kicked open. I sit bolt upright in my bed saying, "What the fuck?" And wham, I get smoked on the top side of my head, knocking me out of the bed and onto the floor. I may have been knocked out at that time, but I'm not really sure. I pull myself up to my feet and turn around to see some dude in all black with his face covered, pointing a shotgun at me. What runs through my mind at this point is, oh fuck, this is not seriously a home invasion. He starts yelling for me to get moving and to go up the stairs. This is when I feel a warm wash running down my face. Blood, and a lot of it. I'm a bit staggered on my feet, both from my earlier consumption of alcohol and from getting hit. Getting up the stairs, he's asking me where the money is. My female roomie has been sat down on an upper flight of stairs with a second robber up in the master bedroom rummaging around looking for stuff, and my second roomie is nowhere to be seen. I should note that the house is a split level, giving 4 floors for a 2-story building. The robber who is with me is yelling at me about, quote, the drugs and the money. They must have the wrong place thinking that we're drug dealers. I mean, we do smoke pot, but by no means have any large amounts of cash or pot around. Now, my memory is fuzzy with everything going on. Some other bad shit that happened to me that I won't really mention here, but my missing roomie had gotten outside when the second guy came downstairs to grab me, with his partner up in the master bedroom looking for shit, allowing him to get outside. My roomie was able to smash a window on the getaway car, but never got the plate number. Your brain will not be able to work right in a situation like this. He also managed to finally get a neighbor awake and a 911 call was made. I'll also note that all he was wearing was a t-shirt. That's it during winter in Canada, and he grabbed an axe on his way out the door. As soon as the sirens were audible, the robbers yelled, "Cops! Cops!" and were off and running. They did get some things, probably about $2,000 worth of electronics and cash, but were probably really pissed as I'm sure they were looking for a much larger score. Looking at the carnage afterward, I had left a very solid trail of blood from my room in the basement up to the main floor. Half my body was covered in it. Head wounds will bleed a lot. News reporters were across the street almost as fast as the cops, and an article was made to the paper the next day. I'm sorry about the wall of text, as it's pretty late here and easier to type out like this trying to remember all of the events. TLDR, gunpoint, hit with shotgun, and shit happens fast in a home invasion. I do traditional archery. I also sleep naked. These will be relevant points in about 20 seconds. My last house wasn't in the nicest of neighborhoods. Not bad, but not really the kind of place you want to leave a door unlocked. Luckily for me, I remembered to lock the door, but I did forget that I'd burned something in the oven earlier and left the kitchen window cracked. At this point, I lived alone with my 2 cats, but my Tom might as well be a guard dog. About 2 in the morning, I heard my cat going apeshit in the living room, and I knew something was up. So I grabbed my bow off the wall and nocked an arrow. I walked into the living room quietly, flipped on the light, and behold, a young man half in, half out of my kitchen window, straddling it like a horse. It's not an easy window to climb through. The sill was about at eye level. I drew back to my anchor, lined up my shot, and said, "Wrong house, motherfucker." He stared at me completely dumbfounded, or terrified or whatever for a moment. Considering that he had just been caught in the act of breaking into my house by a 62-inch bow-wielding woman wearing nothing but socks, I think he handled himself quite well, actually. He promptly rolled out of my window and beat feet. Drew down, rehung my bow, got dressed, and called the police. I really don't think they believed me. The guy was never found. My brother had just left with his friend, so I was home alone at around 7:30 p.m. I'm just sitting up in bed with my dog when all the lights in the house go out. I was thinking that my city just experienced a power outage or something, so I left my room and start walking around the living room. After about 3 minutes of using the flashlight app on my phone, I head back into my room with my dog and lock the door. So I'm in my room watching a YouTube video when I hear something break. Normally, I never thought somebody would try to break into the house, so I said it was the wind that probably just blew something over. Now my dog is snarling, and I shush her when I see some lights going under my door. Someone tries to open it, but luckily I had it locked. While I go into another room, I sneak up to the door and place my ear next to it. I just hear a voice saying, "Grab the laptop." I'm now freaking out, but I still have some doubt that someone would break into my house. I was thinking my brother came back with his friend and were looking around for some stuff, so I yelled, "Who's out there?" No response. So I said again, "Who's out there?" When I didn't get a response that time, I just yelled, "Get out of my house! I'm calling the police!" I then proceed to do exactly as I say, and the police arrive maybe 3 minutes later. The front door was broken into. The robbers had took a stack of quarters and a camera. What scared me the most wasn't the experience, but what my mom said afterwards. She said thank God the robbers weren't professionals, or they might have broken into my room to shut me up. I had nightmares for a couple of days, just thinking what if they tried to break into my room. The whole experience was frightening, but if anything, I'm glad it happened to me instead of one of my cousins. During my sophomore year at the University of Kentucky, approximately 2007, I lived on State Street in a 4-story house notorious for throwing parties just as big, if not bigger, than any fraternity on campus. Now, the only reason I bring this up is because we allowed almost anybody in our house during these parties. and anybody could have used this as an opportunity to scope out what we had inside. One late Friday night, around 4 a.m., two of my buddies and I were in my roommate's room smoking some hookah when we heard some odd noises coming from the living room. As I walk out of this room and down the hall into the living room to see what was going on, I see the intruders drop what they were doing and bolt out of the side door they used to break in. Of course, I ran out of the door and chased after them barefoot and by myself. They ran behind my house towards the street parallel to the one I lived on, taking a path they only would have known about if they had planned this out prior. Upon reaching the adjacent road, Con Terrace if you're familiar, I realized that it was just me chasing after these guys about 15 yards ahead of me. During the pursuit, I see a large green Suburban at the end of the road that is clearly their escape vehicle. After about 10 seconds, one of the three cuts to the left and runs up somebody's driveway. Dumb move, because the Timberlands that he was wearing were untied, and I was easily able to catch up to him. As soon as I had caught up, I grabbed his shirt, threw him to the ground, secured one of his arms, and slammed my knee on his head. I noticed at that point that he had a wireless router that was not mine tucked into the back of his jeans, clearly indicating that my house was not the first one they had hit that night. As he's on the ground, one of his cronies runs up the driveway, but the kid I had subdued yelled to him and told him to go away, that it's not worth it. Keep in mind that my knee is still on his face, so his yell sounded the same as it would if you used your palms to squish your cheeks together. Actually pretty humorous now that I look back at it. The details at this point are somewhat hazy, but I remember looking down at the router that I had pulled from his pants and was in shock at what just happened. I lift my knee up off of his face and stand up, not really knowing what to do. The kid just gets up and runs away, and that was the last I ever saw of him. To this day, I don't really know why I didn't beat the ever-living shit out of this kid. I had him in the palm of my hand and he had just robbed me, hoping for good karma, I guess. After he left, I retraced my steps and picked up one of his Timberlands and a trucker hat that he had lost along the way. When I get back to my house, I call the police and tell them the whole story. Before they showed up though, a sketchy, beat-up Honda Accord with two trashy chicks in it pulled up and asked if anyone named Joe lived in my house. I told them that none of my roommates were named Joe, and they just pulled away immediately. As for what they took, I discovered my Wii and my roommate's car keys and iPod were missing. They had also ripped the cable wire out of our old piece of shit TV that looked like it came straight from the 80s. Not really sure what they were trying to do there, but then again these kids were probably not the sharpest knives in the drawer. Anyway, cops come and tell me that they'll do what they can, but the shoe and the hat that I picked up won't be of any use. Unfortunately, we didn't have any serial numbers on anything that was stolen, so nothing ever came of this scenario. We never got our stuff back. Looking back, I realize that I'm lucky as fuck that they didn't have or use any weapons against me, as I would have not had any way of defending myself. At the same time, one of my biggest regrets is not beating the shit out of that kid who had just robbed me that I had in the palm of my hand. And don't worry, I gave my lazy roommates plenty of shit for not having my back. We aren't really that close of friends anymore anyway. I was in college and back home for the weekend to work. My parents worked nights, and I was home alone in what used to be my bedroom and what was then a den. My parents' home is over 100 years old, and built on a pier and beam foundation. We often heard noises from other rooms, especially the kitchen, and joked that it was the previous owner taking care of the beloved home long after passing away. I say we joked, but we secretly took it serious when we were home alone. Sometimes the noises were loud, and the pets even seemed bothered. In an old house that sits more than 2 feet from the ground, you hear quite a bit of detail. As I was drifting off to sleep, I began to hear sounds of movement in the kitchen, along with running water sounds. The kitchen was across the hallway, about 30 feet from where I was trying to sleep. I was already uneasy about staying alone, so I closed the door to what used to be my bedroom to hopefully block the sounds. It didn't occur to me at all to investigate the noise. We actually heard stuff like this on occasion. Even though it bothered us, we had grown accustomed to it. For a minute or so, I heard a break in the sounds. Then it transitioned to footsteps on the old wooden floor. My heart rate started to increase. Next, I heard the distinct sound of a shoe hitting the bottom of the closed door. The bedroom/den was connected to 3 other rooms. Another, smaller bedroom, a small restroom, and the hallway on the other side of the closed door. There was no accessible exit door from where I was in the house, and all the windows in this area were old and painted shut. I was feeling even more vulnerable since I was just in my underwear. It's just what I wore to bed on warm Texas evenings. I began to contemplate my next steps. This was pre-cell phone days. I made the decision to retreat behind the only lockable door in the connected bathroom. I took the cordless phone from the room with me. I turned on the phone and started to dial 911, and quickly changed my mind. There were two problems. One, the phone beeped with every press of a button. Old cordless phones had no silence option, and I was afraid the intruder would hear the beeps and know my location. And two, I didn't want the intruder to hear me speaking, or the sound of the 911 operator talking. So instead, I dialed my dad's work pager and left the home phone number with 911 on it. He'd know something was wrong and act quickly. I covered the speaker on the phone in an attempt to mute the sounds of the buttons. After paging my dad, things got even more intense. The bedroom/den door opened, and someone was walking slowly around in the room from which I had just retreated. I was terrified. My dad called, and the base station to the cordless phone rang in the room with the intruder. The answering machine picked up, and my dad frantically asked me to pick up. I did not, again fearing the intruder would recognize where I was. I heard the footsteps move faster, but they were still in the room outside of the bathroom. I quickly paged my dad again, and he called back within seconds, leaving another frantic message, even asking why I won't pick up because he knows I'm at home, which both I and the intruder could hear. This happened a few times before my dad announced on the answering machine that he was sending help and that he was on his way. He worked about 15 minutes away. By the time all the yelling over the answering machine had stopped, I heard no more sound outside the room. I quietly waited in the bathroom, the door locked with a tiny hook lock, waiting for help to arrive. Within just a few minutes, I heard someone loudly banging on the front door. They were yelling my name. Before making a break for it, I considered the fact that I would have to enter and run through the areas that I had just recently heard the intruder. After some fast contemplation, I ran for it and found my uncle. I unlocked the door and came outside to stand with him on the front porch. He seemed shocked, as I was in my underwear outside and I was almost crying from the feeling of relief. He thought he was coming to rescue me from an asthma attack or something. I am asthmatic and I had a couple of major attacks as a teenager. My dad sent to rescue me and assumed that I was having an attack and simply didn't have the breath to speak on the phone. If I hadn't gotten to the door, he would have broken the glass. After telling my uncle what happened, we walked together through the house. We found water running in the kitchen, and medical bottles spilled out all over the cabinet. The back door to the house was also open wide. He took me to his house, and my dad met us there. It was finally the end of a very rough hour. I feel like I handled the situation kind of poorly. I didn't find a way to leave the house, and instead backed myself into a corner with no escape. I've replayed that decision many times. Once I heard that shoe on the door, I should have thrown something through a window and gotten out of the house. It's most likely that the intruder wasn't expecting to come across anyone in the house. We never knew for sure, but we suspected it to be a neighbor with an addiction problem who was aware of my parents' work schedule. He had been arrested many other times for non-violent drug, alcohol, or intoxication crimes. A few years ago, me and this guy I'll call AH used to be friends with me, and we would hang out all the time. Over the years, we stopped talking due to me changing schools, and I hadn't talked to him in most of that time. One day, he shows up at my house out of the blue. Something just didn't feel right with the way he acted. He just seemed to be acting odd. I talked to him for a while, like 15 minutes at most, seeing what he had been up to and other small talk. Suddenly, AH then said he had to go, and it felt kind of rushed. It just felt weird. Anyway, to the important part. About 2 weeks later, I woke up around noon to a knock on the door. I was a high school kid and it was on the weekend. I went downstairs to find no one at the front door, but then I heard a knock on my back door, so I ran back there to again find no one. After I heard a knock on the front door again, I figured it was some kind of prank. I looked out the window and this time AH was standing there, so I opened the door. Bang! I get punched in the head by him. I'm dazed, but he just keeps pounding on me. I try to block, but there wasn't much I could do, and he just keeps hitting. I fall to the ground, dazed, and I start to yell I'm not fighting back. There wasn't much I could do at that point, and I had no chance to fight back. But then he stops hitting me. That's when I notice the second guy behind him. He has a knife, and he looks at me, and then he pulls out a hammer and smashes my phone nearby. AH says, If you yell, I'll kill you." I keep quiet, and he duct tapes my mouth and my hands up as the other guy starts bagging up my electronics. I start trying to talk to AH, asking why he's doing this, telling him that we used to be friends and stuff like that. By the way, duct taping someone's mouth doesn't always work, and my breath wore away the adhesive almost immediately. He didn't answer me. He then asked where all the good stuff is. I said upstairs. He got me to show him where it was. I didn't really have too much valuable stuff though. In my room, I had many knives and blades, but I didn't go for them out of fear. He flipped and emptied almost everything in my room and my parents' room, who weren't home. I tried joking with him to ease him up a little bit so he wouldn't hurt me, or so I hoped. After AH and the other guy took as much as they could, AH led me to my basement. I really thought he was going to kill me, but instead he just duct taped me to a pole. He actually said that he was sorry for this, and I would have to wait for my parents to get home. A minute after I heard the footsteps stop, I broke the duct tape. I don't know why at the time, but I went and got a knife from the kitchen to cut the tape I couldn't break from my wrists. It took a lot longer than I thought, probably about 5 minutes, but I then went to the next door neighbors to get them to call the police. And that's about the end of that. Also, I was able to tell the police who did it. I mean, was it really a good idea to rob someone that you know? This wasn't about me, but about my family. One night, my aunt, who was in her late teens or early 20s at the time, was awoken by strange sounds coming from downstairs. It was far too late for anyone to be wandering around the house, so she grabbed a baseball bat and walked into the hall. She checked my uncle's bedroom door, closed. She checked my mom's bedroom door, closed. Grandma wasn't home as she worked nights, so my aunt decides to investigate on her own. She peeks downstairs and can see someone trying to enter through the kitchen window, clad in black. She can't see their face, but she doesn't take any chances. She quietly sneaks back upstairs, grabs the telephone and calls 911. She actually worked at the police dispatch center, so she knew the person who picked up the 911 line. She tells this person to send cops right away, that someone was breaking in. Within just a few minutes, a couple police cars pull up to the house and cops head towards the kitchen, both inside and outside, guns drawn. It seems that the burglar was stuck in the window. The police grabbed him by the legs and pulled him out and had him pinned to the ground. My aunt then comes running up to see who the burglar was. It was my uncle. He had snuck out in the middle of the night to go and get drunk with his friends. He was underage, and he forgot to bring the key and locked himself out. He was so shit-faced and fat that he couldn't manage to push himself through the kitchen window.